A week after the election in Iraq, there's no official winner. Some politicians are crying foul and calling for a recount. But initial results show one big surprise. Controversial Shia cleric Muqtada Al-Sadr making a political comeback. What does this mean for Iraq's future? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The preliminary results are in, but it could take weeks before official winners are announced in Iraq's parliamentary election. The delay has some political leaders claiming fraud and urging the election commission to have a recount. Last Saturday's vote was the first since Iraqi forces defeated ISIL in 2017. But one political headline from the poll is certainly raising eyebrows in the United States and Iran. The coalition led by Shia cleric Muqtada Al-Sadr is emerging as the frontrunner in many of the country's provinces. His victory could complicate Iraq's relations with Washington and Tehran. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, Osama bin Javed has this report from Baghdad.
This has been the lowest turnout in Iraq in recent years, almost 15% lower than what it was in 2014, with just over 44.5% of eligible voters casting their vote. Also, we've been hearing from the Iraqi High Election Commission that the results have been delayed because they're having problems in more than 180 polling stations where results have not been compiled from, especially in northern Iraq in places like Kirkuk, where some election officials have also been not allowed to leave their offices and in a state of similar to a house arrest. This is after the Turkmen and Arabs, as well as some Shia militia members, did not agree with the results, with the perceived results of the elections, as soon as people casted their vote and the election commission came out and gave out the tally of the voters. They've been asking for a manual recount of the votes. So you have to remember that this is the first time Iraq used electronic voting for its election. So far, what we've been hearing from various political parties, people who have not been were not expecting this kind of result, have been saying that they do not accept these results. Even Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi saying that there should be an independent assessment of some polling booths and some boxes, ballot boxes, and then if there are any discrepancies, the whole count should be done again. So there is a lot of pressure on the Iraqi High Election Commission after it announced results, and it has been a surprise result for many. Muqtada Al-Sadr, a cleric which was until a few years ago, was seen as an enemy by the United States, who was fighting US forces while they were here in Iraq. Somebody who has been opposed to both Iran and the United States in recent years, has seen sweeping victories in at least 6 of Iraq's 18 provinces. His party, the Sairun coalition, is aligned with leftist communists as well, and it makes it a very unique composition, a composition which, according to many Iraqi analysts, will not be acceptable for many players, including Iran. So it is going to be a complex situation for Iraqi politics, where in the next 15 days after the election results are announced and there are no objections raised in the court, the president has to call in a session and has to elect a leader of the House, and then they can go towards nominating a prime minister. But until that happens, some people have been saying that it could actually take months before a prime minister is announced, because there is a lot of political wheeling and dealing which will happen before a government takes charge.
So who is Muqtada Al-Sadr? The son of a revered Shia cleric, he rose to prominence during the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 that toppled Saddam Hussein. Sadr is credited with forming the first Shia militia that fought against US troops. His Mahdi army was blamed for stoking sectarian violence and killing Sunni Iraqis in 2006 and 2007. After the Iraqi government's crackdown on the Mahdi army, Sadr fled to Iran and remained in self-imposed exile until 2011. But in recent years, he has not just reinvented himself as an anti-corruption campaigner, he appears to be distancing himself from Iran. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us in Erbil, Judit Neurink, author of The War of ISIS on the Road to the Caliphate. In London, Renad Mansour, fellow at Chatham House for Middle East and North Africa region. Renad is also research fellow at the American University of Iraq-Sulaimani. And in Tunis, Zaid Al-Ali, author of The Struggle for Iraq's Future and former advisor to the UN on Iraq. A warm welcome to you all. Judit, I want to start with you. Is Muqtada Al-Sadr now the kingmaker in Iraq?
Could very well be. All depends, of course, on who is going to be able to form the biggest coalition. Because we have seen in 2010 that it's very possible that not the person who gets the most votes or the bloc that gets the most votes is actually going to form the government. That is going to be the coalition that is the biggest. And that's what at the moment is going on in Baghdad. Parties are trying to make together a coalition that's going to be the biggest, which is not easy because there's so many small parties that came out of these elections.
Zaid, you've written that even though this election has been surprising, that it hasn't signaled major changes. Why is that?
Well, because the end result will be very similar to what your previous guest just alluded to is right. That we're going to have a government formation process. There's going to be a long negotiation process. And in the end, it's inevitable that what we're going to have is going to have a government that will be composed of a coalition between 4 or 5 major alliances. And it's important to note that the winners, or the 3 or 4 major winners or best performers in these elections, aren't parties, they're coalitions. So the Sairun, which is led by Muqtada Al-Sadr, isn't a party, it's a coalition. The same thing applies to Fatah, etc., etc. And then each of these coalitions will join together with other coalitions to form a coalition government. So it's a coalition government that will be made up of other coalitions. And you can just imagine the substantive incoherence that's going to be involved. They won't be able to agree to a coherent political program. They were not going to be able to deliver on the immediate changes that Iraqis are clearly asking for and clearly need. And it's going to lead to more disappointment. It's practically inevitable. Because even if the 4 largest coalitions grouped together managed to reach an agreement, they would have a bare majority in parliament, would be barely able to support their program, whatever it is. So inevitably, even those 4 coalitions aren't going to be enough. They would have to ally themselves with other smaller coalitions. It's going to be a mess.
Renad, what are the primary reasons for Muqtada Al-Sadr's success thus far in this election cycle?
I think there are 2 primary reasons. The first one, and I know there's been a lot of attention, but I think deservedly so, the voter turnout being sort of as low as it was, in fact higher than many Iraqis actually would have expected, is an indication of the divide between the citizen and the leader, or the ruler and the ruled. And so many of the parties and coalitions were just unable to convince the Iraqi electorate that this time around they would get it right, that they would fight corruption, which in itself would mean they'd have to fight themselves because they've all been part of the corrupt elite, as they all admit. So it was hard for them to convince the citizen that they were sort of ready to fight corruption and to fight themselves. Now, the reason why Sadr did as well as he did, I think it's important to note that actually compared to the previous election, as we've seen, he hasn't actually won that many more votes. But because of the lower turnout, with his opponents losing more out of the lower turnout, he's been able to get, let's say, 20 or so more seats, or maybe a bit less than that. Why? Because first, if you look at the sort of pre-election mobilization strategies, his coalition, Sairun, were really the only ones that presented the most amount of new faces. Not that many elite, not that many current or former ministers, really trying to get that kind of fresh start. More importantly, I think, what you've seen since 2012 is Muqtada Al-Sadr's group really trying to bring about change. In 2012, they tried a no-confidence motion against the Prime Minister, then al-Maliki. In 2016, they stormed the Green Zone, they stormed the parliament, calling for a change. And then this time around, there was also these times for change. So I think Zaid is absolutely right. Not much change will come from the electoral process in Iraq. But out of all the candidates, perhaps Sadrists were the ones who actually thought that they were the ones who had demonstrated a willingness to change in the past.
Judit, I saw you nodding along to what Renad was saying there. So I wanted to ask you if you had a reply to what he was saying, and also, to touch on something he was discussing just then. We saw in 2016, Muqtada Al-Sadr had urged his followers to go to the Green Zone, to go into parliament to protest corruption. Is there any leader in Iraq right now that can mobilize such a popular response?
Yeah, this is a very important point. And this is one of the reasons why the communists started to go into a coalition with Muqtada Al-Sadr, because of the millions that he can get onto the streets within a day. And there is no other party that can do that, even though they might have support because of the fight against ISIS. This is not possible. And this is also something that they will have to remember when they are making a coalition. Because if they make a coalition that is not going to include Sadr, that's not going to keep its promises on change, on having new faces, having an end to corruption, having jobs, end of poverty, all those very important issues in Iraq at the moment, then it won't take long before al-Sadr is back to the streets, because in his grains, he is a protest animal. He is the one that goes to the street and protests the government, as he has done in the past. Look at how he started in 2003. He protested the American occupation. So he will keep on doing that. That having said, it's also going to be the big problem that he faces because, and we've seen that a lot in Iraq, those that were in opposition, those that were protesting, what are they going to do when they get to the parliament and to the power themselves? Are they going to be able to actually make the change?
Zaid, you heard Judit there talk about Muqtada Al-Sadr's protests in 2003 of the American occupation in Iraq. I mean, of course, the Mahdi army militia led two uprisings against U.S. forces. Many U.S. military personnel believe that Muqtada Al-Sadr is directly responsible for the deaths of many U.S. troops in Iraq. What does this do, this election result thus far, to the Iraqi-U.S. relationship?
Well, I mean, so Muqtada Al-Sadr isn't just said to be responsible for the death of U.S. troops. He's said to be responsible for the deaths of many Iraqis, including many prominent Iraqis, including the sons and family members of very prominent Shia families as well. And that's worth noting as well in terms of internal Iraqi politics. It makes things very complicated too. But at the same time, even setting aside, or to the extent that's possible, everything that happened from 2003 to 2008, over the past 10 years, Sadr has been very consistent in his rhetoric and in the methods that he's employed. No one really knows, at least it's unclear to me, whether or not it's genuine, but we're going to have to take at face value. And it appears to me that regardless of what happened back in 2003 all the way to 2008, today we have a Sadrist movement that's very different to what it was 10 years ago. And in the end, when the new government is formed, it will contain elements that will be very favorable to the United States. It will also contain elements that will be very favorable to Iran. Those things are inevitable. So in terms of Sadr's relationship or the future government's relationship with the United States or Iran and so on and so forth, I don't expect there to be any major issues. Everyone will come to terms with the new government unless one of the coalitions decides to adopt an aggressive exclusionary attitude, but I don't foresee that as being possible.
Renad, I want to get your take on this. What do you think the U.S. must be thinking right now?
Well, to a large extent, the discourse and what Sadr has been saying for the last few years actually isn't that far off from what the Americans would want in Iraq. They would want Iran not to have that much of an influence in Iraq. And, Sadr's protesting Iran out kind of fits along to that. Sadr's call to end the kind of muhassasa system and that sort of splitting up, dividing of the national apple pie, if you will, in Iraq. The U.S. might also be part of that. The U.S. might want that. So there is a history there, and Sadrists and Americans, it's hard to see them sitting on the same table together, but they do kind of cooperate indirectly through proxies, Europeans and others. There's been a few diplomats recently who have visited Muqtada Al-Sadr, and so. I think what's important to note here is it's in the early 2000s, Muqtada is someone who's very close to the Iraqi street. So he understood during the U.S. occupation that the number one enemy was the Americans. And I'm not trying to obviously excuse this behavior, but he kind of pushed that line. But in more recent years, what the Iraqi street has been demanding is a change in the system and moving away from Iranian power in Iraq. And so he just kind of adopts the new message and kind of wants to push that message. Out of all the leaders that you've had since 2003, I think he's understood the street much better.
Renad, let me follow up what you're saying, because you mentioned diplomacy that Muqtada Al-Sadr has been engaged in. There were a lot of people across the Arab world that were really shocked last year. It was July of 2017 when Muqtada Al-Sadr went to Saudi Arabia at the invitation of the leadership there, and he met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, we're talking at one point in this show about U.S.-Iraqi relationship. We're talking about Iranian-Iraqi relationship. What about the Saudi-Iraqi relationship and what this means for that?
Well, I think very clearly the Saudis have realized that to have influence in Iraq doesn't necessarily mean only supporting the Sunnis, and that the assumption that Iraqi Shias are aligned to Iranian Shias because of Shiism is a farce. And so the Saudis have opened up to both Haider al-Abadi and some of the Da'wah party members, but also to Sadr, because they realize this trend amongst Iraqi Shias, which is moving away from, let's say, Iranian hegemony and kind of a reaction to Iran's influence in Iraq. So the Saudis realized this, and the Sadrs did too, and they reached out. I don't think that Sadr has any problem with diplomatic relations with any country. What he does have a problem with is for any country to interfere in the affairs of his country.
All right, Judit, I want to talk a little bit about where you are in Iraq, in northern Iraq specifically, because you wrote, you were covering, of course, the vote in Iraq's Kurdistan region. You wrote that internally displaced people showed up in droves at the special voting stations that had been set up in Erbil, but that they faced obstacles. What kind of obstacles?
Yeah, that was a major issue, actually. I found many IDPs who were not able to vote because they didn't have the voting cards. Now, IDPs often lose their documents when they flee, and it happened to a lot of Iraqis. Many of them have been able to get some of it back, and some of them even had the voting card of last time, 2014. But many that I saw here in Erbil were not allowed to vote. And people were really eager to vote. Some of them because they had been promised jobs. Of course, this is still Iraq. Some of them because they really wanted to vote for Abadi, hoping that by giving him the votes, this would prevent from former Prime Minister al-Maliki to return. Because many of these IDPs from the liberated areas feel very strongly about this. Maliki is the one that let ISIS in, and yet he was still being elected. He was still on the lists, and they were very scared that if he would come back, things would go very bad for them. So they wanted to vote, but then they couldn't. I also found some people from Baghdad living in Erbil who were told that they should go to Baghdad to vote. So what was happening was very strange, because the Electoral Committee had promised that IDPs would have, they would look after them, they would be able to vote even if they did not have the voting card for this year.
Judit, what about the Kurds? What does this election mean for the Kurds in Iraq? Does it make things better for them? Does it make things worse for them? Or is it just far too early to tell?
Well, it is a bit of a disaster, to be quite honest, because there is a big conflict in Sulaymaniyah where just about everybody says there was fraud. Only PUK is happy with the fact that they won, and that was quite unexpected, because everybody thought that PUK would lose terribly to the opposition parties. The fact that they didn't might, again, have something to do with the low turnout. PUK, like al-Sadr, was able to get the people loyal to the party to go and vote. It might be part of that. But on the other hand, there are people who said they were in a small voting station. They said, I was probably the only one voting there, but I know that I voted for instance, Goran. I don't know which party this was, the Change List party. And then when the votes were counted, there were no votes at all for this party. So something is going on. And up till now, the Electoral Committee has not really wanted to do anything about it. There has been violence between parties. There has been shooting at one of the party headquarters. So this means that the Kurds have really been played a part. And if they want to work together in the government, in the new government, they will have to find some kind of unity. And it looks as if they will be needed for a coalition. So this is a problem. And I know that they're working on it, but first of all, something will have to be done about the Soleimani situation.
Zaid, this is really a remarkable trajectory for Muqtada Al-Sadr, isn't it? I mean, could you talk a little bit about that? We're talking about a former symbol of sectarianism and resistance to becoming this populist politician. How did that happen?
I mean, it's very difficult to explain, but there are antecedents and there are reasons. I mean, Muqtada Al-Sadr represents, and his family has claimed to represent, the marginalized communities of Shia Iraq for a very long time. There's a category of very poor Iraqis who live in slum areas, in the outskirts of the capital, and in southern Iraq who are extremely poor, who've been marginalized for decades now. It's not something that's new. And no one really claims to represent them, including people who are in these elections right now. One of the leaders of one of the major coalitions, in an interview in recent months, denied that there was any poverty in Iraq. He said this wasn't true and said there was exaggerations and so on and so forth, whereas anyone who spends any time in Baghdad or in southern Iraq will immediately see how much poverty there is. So Sadr's family has always been the spiritual or the only people who claim to represent these people. So it's fairly normal that they should be the ones, or it should be expected that they should be the ones to be most vociferous and unhappy with the amount of corruption and poor services in the country. And the other thing that's worth noting as well is that the Sadrist movement and people that are connected to it are amongst the only political groups in the country that aren't drawn from the exile community. And that's a very important distinction, because whereas almost all of the others have their family members living outside of the country, either in the region, in Jordan, Lebanon, or in London, or in the United States, Sadrists and their representatives almost all live within the country, and that creates an also very different relationship with the people. They suffer with the people, whereas the former exile community, most of their families still live outside the country. So the immediate needs of the people aren't felt by people who have been so far in control of the government. So I'm not that surprised.
Renad, we don't have too much time left, but I want to ask you, there are analysts that are speculating that Muqtada Al-Sadr will ultimately strike some kind of a deal, reach an agreement with Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, and that he will keep him as Prime Minister. What do you think the likelihood of that is of happening?
Well, in Iraqi politics, it's impossible to predict because nobody who even wins votes might be the leader, as we've seen in the past. Nonetheless, I think what's become clear is Sadr is willing to work with Abadi. He's not willing to work with others, let's say like Maliki, who's kind of biggest foe. So Sadr needs to now, if this group becomes part of the government coalition, and that's a big if, but if that happens, he'll need to somehow show change. So keeping Abadi there would mean that the ministries would have to move towards what they call technocracy. So we'd have to bring a completely new list of technocratic cabinet members in who aren't aligned to political parties as such, and who can present sort of some kind of change. And this is something that Sadr has been pursuing for some years. I know it's kind of now a kind of a comeback, but I remember being on this show 2 years ago talking about the Sadr's protest and Sadr's return. So he's been working. This is a gradual, the Sadrs view this as a gradual kind of movement where they're trying to pick away through electors, through elections, through protests, through other ways to try and change the elite.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Judit Neurink, Renad Mansour, and Zaid Al-Ali. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.